A janitor walked up to a millionaire and told him not to go on his trip with his wife. The next morning, a luxury car was parked right outside his small house. Mike wiped the sweat off his forehead, his hands tightening around the mop handle. The faint smell of bleach mixed with the lingering scent of expensive cologne, a constant reminder that he spent his days cleaning up after the kind of people who never even noticed he existed. 2 years he had worked at this high-end hotel, scrubbing floors, emptying trash, and keeping things spotless for people who would never give him a second glance. To them, he was just part of the background, like the fancy wallpaper or the marble counters. That morning had started like any other. Mike walked into the penthouse suite of Richard Lawson, the billionaire whose name was always in the news. His routine was simple: wipe down surfaces, vacuum, take out the trash, then move on before anyone even realized he had been there. Richard was the kind of man Mike only ever saw from a distance. Always on the move, surrounded by assistants, barely spending any time in his own hotel room. But that day, something was different. As Mike ran the duster over the nightstand, he heard something that made him stop cold. Voices, low but sharp, coming from the next room. It was not unusual to hear guests talking, but something about this conversation made his stomach twist. He leaned in closer, just enough to make out the words. The voice of a woman, one he recognized. It was Lisa, Richard's wife, a woman he had seen many times in passing. But the tone of her voice was nothing like what a loving wife should sound like. "He will never see it coming," Lisa whispered, her words dripping with venom. Mike felt his pulse speed up. "We will make sure this is the last trip he ever takes," a man responded, his voice low and chilling. Mike did not know that voice, but he knew one thing for sure: this was no ordinary conversation. This was a plan. A plan to murder Richard Lawson. His hands gripped the duster so tight his knuckles turned white. The air conditioner hummed in the background, the hallway outside was filled with distant chatter, but all Mike could hear was the pounding of his own heart. He should walk away, pretend he heard nothing, just keep his head down like always. But he could not. His feet would not move. "Ryan, we need to be careful." Lisa's voice came again, sharp and cold. "One mistake, and it is all over." Ryan. Mike had no idea who Ryan was, but he knew one thing: Lisa was not married to anyone named Ryan. This was not just about murder. This was betrayal. A heavy weight settled in his chest. Lisa and her lover were planning to get rid of Richard during his next trip, and no one else knew about it. Mike stepped back from the door, his breath coming in short gasps. What was he supposed to do? Call the cops? Tell someone? But who would believe him? He was just a janitor. People like Lisa did not even acknowledge people like him existed. And if he did speak up, what if they found out? Lisa and this Ryan guy had no problem planning one murder. What was stopping them from silencing him too? He glanced at his reflection in the spotless mirror. He felt small, like a nobody. But that smallness could be an advantage. They did not know he had heard them. They did not know he even mattered. He could slip away, pretend he knew nothing, and go on with his life. His hands shook as he forced himself to finish cleaning, his body on autopilot, while his mind spun in 1,000 directions. Maybe Richard was not a good man. Most rich folks were not. But did that mean he deserved to die? Could Mike live with himself if he just let it happen? By the time he left the suite, his decision was made. He could not just stand by and do nothing. He had to warn him. That night, Mike sat in the janitor's closet, staring at a cup of cheap coffee that had long gone cold. He kept replaying the conversation in his head. What if Lisa had seen him? What if Ryan figured out someone had been in the room? The thought made him shudder. He had to be smart about this. He could not just walk up to Richard and spill everything. The guy probably would not even believe him. And if Lisa got wind of it, she would make sure he never got another word out. But Mike was not a coward. He might not have much, but he had his conscience. And that was enough. The next morning, Richard Lawson strode into the hotel lobby, as confident as ever, surrounded by his usual entourage. Mike spotted him from across the room, his heart hammering in his chest. This was his one shot. Taking a deep breath, he moved toward the billionaire, his mind racing with what to say. When he finally reached him, he swallowed hard and spoke before he lost his nerve. "Mr. Lawson," he called, his voice steady, but his hands clenched into fists. Richard stopped, eyes narrowing as he glanced at him. "Yes?" Mike hesitated for only a second before pushing forward. "I need to tell you something about your trip. Do not go. It is not safe." Richard's eyebrow lifted, skepticism written all over his face. He glanced at Mike's name tag, his expression unreadable. "And why should I trust you?" Mike knew there was a good chance the man would ignore him. But he had done what he could. He had warned him. Whether Richard listened or not, that was out of his hands now. Richard stared at him for a long moment, the usual noise of the lobby buzzing around them. Hotel guests checking in, bellhops rushing around, business people heading out the doors. But for Mike, everything felt frozen in time. Finally, Richard spoke, his tone unreadable. "I do not make decisions based on vague warnings from strangers." Mike stood his ground, watching as the billionaire walked away, disappearing into the crowd. He had done what he could. Now, it was up to Richard to decide if he wanted to listen. Mike felt a jolt of panic rise in his chest. He was not going to believe him. Why would he? He was just a janitor, someone who faded into the background. Who was he to tell a man like Richard Lawson what to do? But he could not back down now. "Please," he whispered, leaning in closer to make sure no one else heard. "I cannot explain everything, but trust me. Do not go on that trip." For a split second, something flickered in Richard's eyes. Doubt? Curiosity? Mike could not tell. The billionaire straightened up, gave him one last look, and then turned away. "I will think about it," Richard said over his shoulder, his voice clipped, dismissive. And just like that, he was gone. Mike stood frozen, watching him disappear into the crowd. That was it. He had done everything he could. Now, it was out of his hands. His heart pounded as he made his way back to the maintenance area, his mind spinning with fear and uncertainty. What if Richard ignored him? What if Lisa and Ryan followed through with their plan? The weight of what he had overheard felt heavier than ever. The rest of his shift passed in a blur. He went through the motions, mopping floors and scrubbing surfaces, but his mind was somewhere else. He kept replaying his conversation with Richard, wondering if the man would take him seriously or dismiss him like so many rich guests would. That evening, as Mike walked home through the crowded streets, he could not shake the sense of unease. The city buzzed around him, cars honking, food vendors shouting, tourists snapping pictures, but none of it felt real. All he could think about was what he had heard in that suite. The air felt heavy, pressing against his chest. What if Lisa and Ryan had already realized something was wrong? When he finally arrived at his tiny apartment, the silence was suffocating. He paced back and forth, his thoughts spiraling. What if they found out it was him? What if Lisa had noticed someone was in the suite and figured out he had overheard? He tried to push the thoughts away, but sleep did not come easy that night. The next morning, as he stepped outside, he froze in his tracks. Parked right in front of his building was a sleek black car, the kind that did not belong in his rundown neighborhood. The sunlight reflected off its polished surface, making it stand out even more against the cracked sidewalks and old brick buildings. Mike's stomach twisted. Who would be waiting here? And more importantly, who were they waiting for? He considered turning back inside, but then he saw him, the driver. A man dressed in a crisp black suit stepped out, adjusting his hat before locking eyes with Mike. His heart pounded, every instinct telling him to run, but he stayed put. "Mr. Mike?" the man asked, his voice smooth and calm. Mike swallowed hard and nodded, unable to find his voice. The driver reached into his jacket and pulled out a white envelope, holding it out to him. "This is for you." Mike hesitated before taking it, his hands unsteady. Who sent this? He finally asked, barely above a whisper. The driver gave a small, knowing smile. Mr. Lawson. He wanted to make sure you got it. Mike's breath caught. Richard. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. What was this? He glanced down at the envelope, thick, expensive, with his name written in perfect script. Before he could ask another question, the driver tipped his hat, turned, and got back into the car. Within seconds, the sleek vehicle disappeared down the street, leaving Mike standing there, heart racing. Back in his apartment, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope as if it might explode. Finally, he slid his finger under the seal and opened it carefully. Inside was a single note, written in the same precise handwriting. Thank you for your concern. I have decided to cancel the trip. Enclosed is something I believe you will find useful. Mike's fingers trembled as he reached inside and pulled out a second item. A key. It was small, attached to a silver keychain with a single engraving, Wilshire Towers. Mike frowned. Wilshire Towers was a high-end apartment complex downtown, the kind of place he had never even dreamed of affording. Why was Richard giving him this? His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. A message from an unknown number popped up. Your new place is ready. Welcome to a fresh start. RL. Mike blinked at the screen, struggling to process what was happening. A fresh start? Was this real? He had expected a simple thank you, if anything at all, but this? An apartment? His whole life had been a fight just to survive, paycheck to paycheck, and now Richard Lawson, a billionaire he barely knew, was offering him something life-changing. But why? Why had Richard listened to him? Why had he believed the warning? As these thoughts churned in his mind, one thing became clear. His life had just taken a turn he never saw coming. The sun was setting as Mike made his way toward Wilshire Towers. The key felt heavy in his pocket, an undeniable symbol of everything that had changed in the span of a day. His steps were slow, hesitant. This did not feel real. Even as the towering building loomed closer, its glass facade reflecting the fading light of the city, Mike still could not wrap his mind around it. Why would Richard Lawson, one of the richest men in the world, go out of his way to offer him a new place to live? It felt strange, like there was some unspoken condition he had yet to uncover. But the note had been clear. A fresh start. Those words echoed in his mind as he approached the entrance of the building, his heart racing in his chest. The doorman greeted him with a polite nod, as if people like him walked through these doors every day. It was surreal. He had cleaned enough high-end places to know how out of place he was here. But still, he handed the man the key and watched as he typed something into the security system. Mr. Mike, right? You are all set. Elevator to your right. Take it to the 15th floor, the doorman said with a practiced smile. Mike mumbled his thanks, stepping into the elevator. The doors closed with a soft whoosh. The ride up felt like forever, even though it could not have been more than a minute. His pulse quickened with each passing floor. By the time the doors opened, he felt like he was in a dream. Stepping out into a hallway, he found himself in front of apartment 1504. The key turned easily in the lock, and as he pushed the door open, Mike's breath caught in his throat. The apartment was stunning, far more luxurious than anything he had ever imagined. Hardwood floors gleamed under the recessed lighting, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Everything was immaculate, from the modern furniture to the sleek kitchen appliances he had only ever seen in magazines. He wandered through the space in a daze, fingers brushing over the smooth surfaces of the counters, the soft fabric of the couch. It did not feel real. How could this be his life now? Just days ago, he was scrubbing floors, barely making rent. And now? Now he was standing in a place like this. The thought made him stop in his tracks, a sudden wave of unease crashing over him. This did not make sense. Nothing about this situation made sense. Had Richard done this out of gratitude? But this was too much, far too much for a simple warning. Mike found himself sinking into one of the chairs, his head in his hands. He had done the right thing, had he not? Warning Richard had been the only choice he could live with. But now, with the weight of this new apartment pressing down on him, he could not shake the feeling that something else was going on. What had he gotten himself into? A knock at the door startled him, pulling him out of his thoughts. His heart skipped a beat as he stood, crossing the room to answer it. When he opened the door, a young man stood there holding a clipboard. He was dressed in a black suit, professional but casual, and smiled warmly when he saw Mike. "Mr. Mike, I presume?" he asked, glancing at the clipboard. "Yes, that is me," Mike replied cautiously. "Good evening. I am Evan, Mr. Lawson's assistant," he said, extending a hand. Mike shook it hesitantly. "I have been instructed to give you a quick tour of the building, show you the amenities, and make sure you are all settled in." Mike blinked, his mind struggling to keep up. "A tour?" Evan nodded, his smile unwavering. "Yes, Mr. Lawson wants to ensure you are comfortable. He is very particular about his guests." Guests. The word stuck in his mind. That was what he was to Richard, just a guest in this extravagant world. He was not sure if that made him feel better or worse. But as Evan led him through the building, showing him the gym, the pool, the private lounge areas, all Mike could think about was how out of place he felt in this world of wealth and privilege. By the time they returned to the apartment, his head was spinning. Evan handed him a small card with his contact information and a polite goodbye before leaving him alone once more. The silence of the apartment was overwhelming. Mike sat down on the edge of the plush bed, staring at the city lights through the window. What was he supposed to do now? Was this really his life? And what did Richard expect in return? His thoughts spiraled again, but he was too exhausted to keep worrying. Eventually, he crawled under the covers, the soft sheets a stark contrast to the scratchy ones he was used to. Sleep came quickly, but it was restless, filled with fragmented dreams of danger and whispered threats. The next morning, Mike woke to the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. He reached for it groggily, blinking at the unfamiliar number on the screen. His thumb hovered over the answer button, his pulse quickening. "Hello?" he answered, his voice still thick with sleep. "Mr. Mike?" The voice on the other end was brisk and efficient. "This is Detective Richard with the NYPD. I need to ask you a few questions regarding Mr. Richard Lawson." Mike's blood ran cold. What had happened? Why was a detective calling him? He sat up quickly, his mind racing. "What is this about?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The detective's tone remained firm. "There have been some developments. I understand you have been in contact with Mr. Lawson recently, and we would like to speak with you in person. Could you come down to the station today?" Mike's heart pounded in his chest. His mind instantly flashed back to the conversation he had overheard. Lisa's voice whispering those chilling words about the trip. Was this about that? Was Richard okay? I can come in," he stammered, his throat dry. "Is Mr. Lawson all right?" There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to send a fresh wave of panic through him. "I will explain everything when you get here, Mr. Mike," the detective said, and then the line went dead. Mike sat there for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand. His stomach twisted in knots. What had happened to Richard? Was this about the murder plot? Did Lisa and Ryan know he had warned him? With trembling hands, Mike got dressed, his mind spinning with questions and fear. As he made his way out of the building, the weight of the key in his pocket felt heavier than ever. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. The city streets felt different as Mike walked toward the police station, his mind clouded with uncertainty. The usual sounds of New York, honking horns, distant chatter, the constant hum of life, felt muffled, as though the world had shifted without him noticing. He kept replaying the detective's voice in his mind. Something had happened to Richard Lawson. Something serious enough to involve the police. As he entered the station, the fluorescent lights above buzzed quietly, casting a sterile glow over the bustling room. The air was thick with the scent of burnt coffee and paperwork. He had never been in a police station before, not even as a visitor, and now his heart pounded as he approached the front desk. Mike took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I am here to see Detective Richard." The officer at the desk barely glanced up, his expression indifferent. "Go through there. Second office on the right." Mike swallowed hard and moved through the doors, his legs feeling like they were made of stone. The weight of everything pressed down on him. What if Lisa had figured out he was the one who warned Richard? What if Ryan was involved? The possibilities churned in his mind, each one worse than the last. He knocked lightly on the door, his hand trembling just enough for him to notice. After a moment, the door opened to reveal a man in his late 40s. His face was serious, but not unkind. He wore a plain suit, the kind of professional uniform that did not reveal much about the man wearing it. "Mr. Mike?" he asked, motioning for him to step inside. "I am Detective Richard." Mike nodded, stepping into the small office. The room was cramped, with stacks of files on every available surface. Richard gestured toward a chair across from his desk, and Mike sat down, gripping the arms of the chair a little too tightly. "Thank you for coming in," Richard said as he settled behind the desk and pulled out a folder. He flipped through a few pages before finally looking up. "I am going to get right to it. Mr. Lawson recently canceled the trip. From what I understand, you advised him to do so." Mike swallowed hard. He had known this was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud made his stomach twist. "Yes," he admitted. "I overheard something, and I thought it was dangerous for him to go." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, his full attention on Mike. "Can you explain exactly what you overheard?" Taking a deep breath, Mike recounted the conversation he had overheard between Lisa and Ryan in the hotel room. He left nothing out, describing their voices, the way Lisa had spoken about making sure the trip would be Richard's last. As he spoke, he could feel his heartbeat pounding harder, the tension thick in the air. Richard listened without interruption, his face unreadable as he scribbled notes on the pad in front of him. When Mike finished, the detective sat back, considering him carefully. "Mr. Lawson canceling the trip may have saved his life," Richard said slowly. "But there is more to the story. We believe Mr. Lawson has been investigating his wife for some time now, and what you overheard may just be the tip of the iceberg." Mike blinked, his mind racing. "Investigating her? For what?" Richard's expression hardened slightly. "Financial fraud, infidelity, and now, it seems, attempted murder. Mr. Lawson has been gathering evidence, but it was not until he received your warning that he realized just how serious the situation was. He has been working closely with us ever since." The weight of Richard's words settled over Mike like a heavy blanket. Richard had known. He had known something was wrong all along. And now, with Mike's warning, it had all come to light. Mike felt a strange mix of relief and dread. On one hand, he had done the right thing. On the other, he was now more entangled in this dangerous situation than he had ever wanted to be. "Is Richard safe?" Mike asked, his voice quieter now. Richard hesitated before answering. "For now, yes. We have placed him under protective custody while we gather more evidence, but we need to tread carefully. Lisa Lawson is not the kind of woman who will go down without a fight, and her lover, Ryan, is just as dangerous." Mike nodded, gripping the chair a little tighter. He had always known that the world of the wealthy was different from his own, but this, murder, fraud, betrayal, was something else entirely. And yet, somehow, he had become a part of it. "I understand," he said, though his mind was still spinning with everything he had just learned. Richard studied him for a moment longer, then leaned forward, his tone softening slightly. "I know this is a lot to take in, and I am sure you are scared, but you did the right thing by coming forward. Mr. Lawson owes you his life." His words should have made Mike feel better, but they did not. If anything, they only reminded him of how fragile everything had become. If Lisa and Ryan were willing to kill Richard, what would they do to him if they found out he had been the one to warn him? Before he could say anything more, Richard stood up, signaling the end of their conversation. "We are going to keep an eye on things," he assured Mike. "But I need you to stay in touch. If you notice anything suspicious, if anyone contacts you, anything at all, you call me immediately. We cannot afford to take any chances." Mike nodded and stood, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. He left the station in a daze, his mind buzzing with everything Richard had told him. Protective custody, financial fraud, betrayal, it all felt too big, too dangerous. The walk back to his apartment felt like a blur. By the time he stepped inside, his body was running on autopilot. He locked the door behind him and leaned against it, trying to calm the racing thoughts in his head. He had done the right thing, Richard had said. But at what cost? His phone buzzed again, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it from his pocket, his breath catching when he saw the number. It was not one he recognized, but something about it sent a chill down his spine. With shaking hands, he answered. "Hello?" A long pause. Then the sound of soft breathing on the other end. And finally, a voice he recognized all too well. "Mike," Lisa's voice purred through the line, sending a shiver down his spine. "We need to talk." Mike's stomach twisted, his hand gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. How had Lisa gotten his number? What did she want? "You think you are clever, do you?" Lisa continued, her voice icy now. "But you have made a big mistake. People like you do not mess with people like me and get away with it. I will make sure of that." The line went dead before Mike could respond, but the threat hung in the air like a dark cloud. Mike dropped the phone onto the counter, his heart pounding in his chest. He had known this was coming, but the reality of it was much worse than he had anticipated. Lisa knew. And she was not going to let him get away with it. Mike's hands shook as he stared down at his phone. The dial tone still hummed in his ears long after Lisa had hung up. His mind raced, his heart pounding so loudly he could feel it in his throat. The threat Lisa had made was not just empty words. It felt like a promise, cold and terrifying. What was he going to do? Mike paced his apartment, the feeling of being trapped slowly sinking in. The bright, luxurious space that had seemed like an impossible dream just days before now felt suffocating. Every shadow seemed darker. Every noise from the hallway made him jump. He was in danger. And there was no telling what Lisa would do next. Mike could not shake the feeling that Lisa or Ryan could be out there, waiting, watching. He thought about calling Detective Richard, telling him about Lisa's phone call. But what could they really do? The police could not guard him every second of the day, and he was not about to run and hide. Not yet. Not until he figured out what all of this meant, and what his role in this twisted mess had become. As his thoughts spiraled, a sharp knock at the door jolted him back to reality. Mike's breath caught in his throat. He was not expecting anyone. Was it Lisa? Had she come for him already? He hesitated, his hand hovering near the doorknob. After a long, tense moment, he finally peeked through the peephole. To his surprise, it was not Lisa or Ryan. It was Richard Lawson. His heart leaped into his throat. He had not seen Richard since their brief encounter at the hotel, and now, here he was, standing at his door, looking disheveled and tense. Without thinking, Mike quickly unlocked the door and pulled it open. "Richard," he breathed, his voice laced with both relief and confusion. "What are you doing here?" Richard stepped inside, his eyes scanning the apartment before settling on him. He looked different from the polished, composed businessman Mike had seen at the hotel. His hair was slightly messy, his suit rumpled, and there was an intensity in his gaze that made Mike's pulse quicken. "I needed to talk to you," Richard said, his voice low and urgent. "There is more to this than you know, Mike. Much more." Mike's mind spun. More? What could be more than an attempted murder and a web of lies? He closed the door behind him, bracing himself for whatever bombshell was about to drop. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What else could there be?" Richard ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small space of the living room. "After you warned me about Lisa and Ryan, I started digging deeper. I knew something was wrong, but I did not realize just how far back this goes." He stopped, turning to face Mike. It is about your father. Mike's world stopped spinning. His father? He had not thought about him in years. The man had died when he was young, leaving him and his mother to struggle on their own. But what could his father possibly have to do with any of this? My father? Mike echoed, his voice trembling. What does he have to do with any of this? Richard sighed, his expression softening for the first time since he had arrived. I did not realize it until recently, but your father and I were close friends when we were kids. We grew up together. He was like a brother to me. Mike nearly lost his balance. His father had never mentioned Richard. Never spoken about any old friends or connections from his past. It had always been just the two of them, scraping by, surviving day by day. This did not make sense. I do not understand, Mike said, his voice shaking. My father died in an accident years ago. What does that have to do with Lisa and Ryan? Richard stepped closer, his expression filled with a mix of guilt and determination. That accident was not an accident, Mike. Your father was involved in something much bigger, something dangerous, and I think Lisa had something to do with it. Mike's legs felt weak, and he sank into the nearest chair, his mind reeling. His father's death was not an accident. His breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to process what Richard was telling him. He had always believed his father's death was a tragic, random event. But now, Richard was telling him it was connected to this web of deceit, murder, and betrayal. I do not know all the details yet, Richard continued, his voice softer now. But I found enough to know that your father was framed for something he did not do. He got caught up in something with Lisa's family years ago, something that cost him his life. And now, it is all coming back. Mike's head spun. His father, framed, murdered. And now Lisa, the woman he had overheard plotting to kill Richard, was somehow connected to his father's death. The world around him blurred as the weight of it all crashed down on him. Why did you not tell me this sooner? He asked, his voice barely audible. Richard's eyes darkened. I was not sure. I needed more proof. And honestly, I did not want to drag you into this unless I had to. But now, with Lisa threatening you, I cannot keep it from you any longer. You deserve to know the truth. Mike's mind raced, trying to piece everything together. His father had been connected to Richard's world in ways he never imagined. And now, he was caught in the middle of a decades-old conspiracy, one that had claimed his father's life and now threatened his own. What do we do? He asked, his voice small but steady. How do we stop her? Richard's gaze hardened. We gather evidence. We expose her for everything she has done. But it is going to take time, and it is going to be dangerous. Lisa is not just playing games anymore. She is ruthless. And now that she knows you are involved. He did not have to finish the sentence for Mike to understand the gravity of the situation. Lisa was coming for him. And she was not going to stop until he was silenced for good. For a long moment, the room was filled with silence, both of them lost in their thoughts. Mike's mind buzzed with fear, anger, and determination. He had spent his entire life living in the shadows, struggling to survive, never imagining that his past held such dark secrets. But now, those secrets were coming to light. And he had no choice but to face them head on. I am not going to run, Mike said, his voice firm. If Lisa is responsible for my father's death, I need to know the truth. And I need to make sure she pays for what she has done. Richard nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. We will do it together, Mike. But we have to be careful. Lisa is dangerous, and she has people on her side who will do anything to protect her. Mike stood, feeling a surge of strength he had not felt in days. He was not going to let fear control him anymore, not after everything he had learned. His father had been taken from him, and now Lisa was threatening to take even more. But Mike was not that scared, invisible janitor anymore. He was ready to fight. The days that followed Richard's revelation were a whirlwind. Mike found himself unable to focus on anything else. His work at the hotel, his daily routines, everything felt insignificant compared to the weight of the truth he was uncovering. He could not shake the thought that his father's death was not the accident he had always believed. It was a cover-up, a murder disguised as a tragedy, and Lisa had a hand in it. But the biggest shock was realizing he had a connection to Richard Lawson that stretched back decades. He had grown up thinking he was just another faceless person in a sea of ordinary lives, scraping by with no idea that his roots were tied to wealth and power, wealth he had never known existed. Richard had been distant since their last meeting, sending occasional updates, but keeping a low profile. The police investigation was ongoing, and he was working closely with Detective Richard to build a case against Lisa. But the process was slow and riddled with complications, and each day that passed felt like another day Lisa was getting closer to Mike. As he sat in his new apartment, staring out at the New York skyline, Mike felt the walls closing in on him. The luxury that had once seemed like a dream now felt like a gilded cage, trapping him in a world he barely understood. He was safe here, for now. But he knew it would not last. Lisa had found him once, and she could do it again. A knock on the door startled him out of his thoughts. For a moment, his heart raced, expecting the worst, Lisa's men, or worse, Lisa herself. But when he opened the door, he was greeted by the familiar face of Detective Richard. His expression was grim, and Mike knew immediately that something had happened. "Can I come in?" the detective asked, his voice calm but serious. Mike nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. The tension in the room was palpable as Richard settled into one of the chairs, his eyes scanning the apartment as if making sure they were alone. "We have uncovered more information about your father," Richard began, his tone measured. "I know this has been difficult for you, but I need you to hear everything. Are you ready for that?" Mike's breath caught in his throat. He was not sure he was ready, but he knew he did not have a choice. He had to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. "Tell me," he said softly. Richard pulled out a folder from his briefcase, laying it on the table between them. He opened it to reveal documents, photographs, and police reports, all related to his father. Mike's eyes flicked over the papers, his stomach twisting in knots as the detective began to speak. "Your father, Thomas, was not just an ordinary man. He had ties to some powerful people who operated in the shadows, using their wealth and influence to control those around them. One of those people was Lisa's father." Mike's heart sank. He had known Lisa was connected to this, but hearing it out loud made it feel even more real, more terrifying. "What happened to him?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Richard sighed, flipping through the documents. "Thomas got involved in something he could not escape. He was framed for embezzling money from Lisa's father's company, but the truth is, he was set up. He knew too much about their illegal dealings, and they needed a way to get rid of him without raising suspicion." Mike's eyes widened as the detective continued. "The car accident that killed your father was no accident. It was orchestrated by Lisa's family to silence him before he could expose their crimes. He was a threat to them, and they dealt with him in the only way they knew how." The room seemed to close in on Mike as the weight of Richard's words settled over him. His father had been murdered, not because of something he had done, but because he had been trying to do the right thing. He had been silenced, just like Lisa was trying to do to him now. Mike swallowed hard, fighting back the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "Why did no one tell me?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Why did I never know about any of this?" Richard's expression softened. "Because they made sure you would not find out. After your father's death, they covered their tracks. Your family was left with nothing, no trace of the truth. You and your mother were left to believe it was just a tragic accident." Mike's hands clenched into fists. The anger, the pain, it all bubbled to the surface at once. He had lived his entire life believing in a lie, and now the truth was more devastating than he could have ever imagined. "I have been trying to gather more evidence," Richard continued, "but Lisa's family is powerful. They have covered their tracks well. The only reason we know any of this now is because of what is happening with Richard Lawson. He is digging into the past, and it is bringing up things they thought were long buried. Mike took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. What do I do now? How do we stop her? Richard looked at him, his eyes filled with both sympathy and resolve. We need to find concrete proof, something that ties Lisa directly to your father's death. Without it, she will keep getting away with everything she has done. Mike's mind raced. He had to find that proof. He could not let Lisa get away with this, not after everything he had learned. But how? How could he, an ordinary man, go up against someone like Lisa? The odds felt overwhelming, but he knew he could not give up. Not now. There is something else, Richard said, breaking the silence. He hesitated for a moment, as if unsure of how to proceed. Richard Lawson, he has been looking into your past, too. He found out that you are the rightful heir to a portion of your father's estate. Money that was taken from your family when Lisa's father framed him. Mike's eyes widened. What? Richard nodded. You are not just connected to Richard through your father's friendship. Legally, you are entitled to a significant amount of money that Lisa's family has kept hidden for years. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Mike had spent his entire life scraping by, working long hours for little pay, never imagining that there was a fortune tied to his name. And now here it was, dropped in his lap like a bomb. That is why Lisa is so determined to silence you, Richard explained. Mike sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. The puzzle pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was darker and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. He was not just a witness in Lisa's web of lies, he was a threat to everything she had built. I do not care about the money, Mike said after a long pause. I just want justice for my father. Richard nodded, his respect for Mike clear. We will get it. But you need to be careful. Lisa will not stop until she is sure you are no longer a threat. Mike's heart pounded in his chest. He had already been pulled deeper into this world than he ever wanted to be. But now, there was no turning back. Lisa had taken everything from him, his father, his family's legacy, and now, she was trying to take his life too. But Mike was not going to let her. She cannot get away with this. Richard squeezed his hand, his expression filled with admiration. You are stronger than you know, Mike. But we need to be smart about this. We do not have enough evidence yet to take her down. We need something concrete, something that ties her directly to your father's death and their illegal activities. Mike's mind raced as he thought about what Richard was saying. What about Ryan? He is involved too. If we can get him to turn on Lisa, maybe he will tell us what we need to know. Richard nodded. I have thought about that. Ryan's loyalty to Lisa is questionable at best. He is in this for the money, not for her. If we can make him believe that siding with us is his best option, he might be willing to talk. Mike felt a surge of hope. It was a risky plan, but it was the best shot they had. How do we get to him? Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I have been keeping tabs on him. He frequents a bar downtown, a place Lisa would never set foot in. It is low-key, out of the way. I think it is where he goes to unwind, away from the scrutiny of Lisa's world. Mike's heart pounded in his chest. The idea of confronting Ryan terrified him. But if they could get him to crack, it could be the break they needed. We need to move fast, he said. Lisa is already on to me. She called me the other day, threatening me. Richard's eyes widened in alarm. She called you? What did she say? She said I made a big mistake, Mike replied, his voice shaking slightly. That people like me do not mess with people like her and get away with it. Richard's jaw tightened, anger flashing in his eyes. She is not going to get away with this. We will make sure of that. Mike nodded, feeling the resolve settle deeper in his chest. They had to move quickly before Lisa tightened her grip on the situation. Every second counted now, and they could not afford to waste any time. They finished their meeting quickly, agreeing to meet at the bar where Ryan frequented later that night. As Mike walked out of the cafe, he could not help but feel a mix of fear and determination. This was it, the moment they had been working toward. If they could get Ryan to talk, they could finally bring Lisa down. But if they failed, the consequences did not bear thinking about. That evening, Mike met Richard outside the bar, his nerves on edge. The neon lights flickered overhead, casting a dull glow over the cracked sidewalk. The bar was not anything special, the kind of place that blended into the background of New York's sprawling nightlife scene. But tonight, it felt like the center of the universe. You ready for this? Richard asked, his voice steady but tense. Mike nodded, though his stomach was in knots. As ready as I will ever be. They entered the bar together, the dim lighting and low murmur of voices immediately enveloping them. The smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke hung in the air, a sharp contrast to the clean, polished environments they were used to. It felt dangerous in a way, but that only seemed fitting. Ryan was there, just as Richard had predicted, sitting alone at the far end of the bar. He did not notice them at first, his attention focused on the drink in front of him. Mike's heart pounded in his chest as he and Richard made their way toward him. When they reached him, Richard spoke first. Ryan. Ryan looked up, surprise flashing in his eyes. For a moment, he looked like he might bolt, but Richard quickly took the seat next to him, blocking any potential escape. We need to talk, Richard said, his voice low and firm. Ryan glanced between them, suspicion flickering across his face. What is this about? Mike leaned forward, his voice steady despite the nerves twisting in his stomach. It is about Lisa. We know everything. Ryan's eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of something, fear, uncertainty, in his expression. He did not respond, waiting for them to continue. You are in deep, Ryan, Richard said, his tone cutting through the tension. But it does not have to end badly for you. If you cooperate with us, we can protect you. But you need to help us bring Lisa down. Ryan's jaw clenched, his eyes darting around the room. Mike could see the internal struggle playing out in his mind. He was not loyal to Lisa, not really. He was loyal to the money, the lifestyle. And if he thought his safety was in jeopardy, there was a good chance he would flip. You do not know what she is capable of, Ryan muttered, his voice low. Mike leaned in closer, his voice soft but insistent. I know she killed my father. I know she will do anything to protect herself. But you do not have to go down with her, Ryan. You can walk away from this. For a long moment, Ryan did not say anything. The silence stretched between them, heavy with tension. But finally he sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. All right, he said quietly. I will tell you what you need to know. Ryan's confession was quiet, almost subdued, but the impact of his words hit Mike and Richard like a tidal wave. Sitting there in the dim, smoky bar, with the hum of conversations around them, Mike could hardly believe what he was hearing. The full extent of Lisa's crimes was deeper, more insidious than even he had imagined. Ryan leaned back in his chair, his eyes darting nervously around the room as if Lisa might appear at any moment. You do not get it, he said, his voice trembling slightly. Lisa does not just protect herself, she erases problems. People who cross her, they do not just disappear. They are destroyed. Mike swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. What do you mean? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ryan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. She is ruthless. Her father taught her everything. They have been running scams, frauds, backdoor deals for years, all under the radar. And when someone threatens to expose them, they make sure that person is not around to cause trouble. Your father, he was not the first. Richard clenched his jaw, the anger in his eyes palpable. And you were okay with that? He asked, his voice low and controlled. You were okay with helping her cover up murder? Ryan flinched, guilt flashing across his face. I did not know how far it went at first. I thought it was just about the money. But once I was in, there was no way out. Lisa made sure of that. Mike stared at Ryan, feeling a sickening mixture of anger and pity. He was weak, but at least he was talking now. He could not let his emotions cloud the mission. You need to give us something we can use against her, he said, his voice firm. Something solid, something that ties her directly to my father's death. Ryan nodded, glancing around the bar again. There are files, he said after a moment. Lisa has kept records of everything. It is how she controls people, blackmail, leverage. If you get those files, you can bury her. Where are they? Richard asked, leaning in closer. Ryan hesitated, then lowered his voice even further. She keeps them in a safe at her family's estate upstate. No one goes there anymore except her. The place is practically abandoned, but she still uses it to hide anything she does not want anyone finding. Mike felt a surge of hope. This was the break they needed. If they could get their hands on those files, they would have everything they needed to take Lisa down, for his father's death, for the fraud, for everything. Can you get us in? Richard asked. Ryan shook his head quickly. No way. If she even suspects I am involved, I am dead. But the estate is not heavily guarded. Lisa thinks no one knows about it. If you are careful, you could get in without anyone noticing. Richard nodded, already thinking through the logistics. We will handle it. But you need to stay out of sight. If Lisa finds out you flipped, she will come after you too. Ryan did not argue. He looked like a man on the edge, barely holding it together. Mike wondered if, deep down, he regretted ever getting involved with Lisa in the first place. But now was not the time for sympathy. They had a mission. After leaving the bar, Mike and Richard walked down the street in silence, the cool night air sharp against their skin. The enormity of what they were about to do hung between them like a storm cloud. Breaking into Lisa's family estate was dangerous. If they were caught, there was no telling what Lisa might do. We have to be smart about this, Richard said after a while, breaking the silence. If we go in unprepared, we are done. Mike nodded, though his nerves were frayed. I know, but we cannot wait. The longer we wait, the more time Lisa has to figure out we are onto her. We need to act fast. Richard stopped walking, turning to face him. His eyes were intense, filled with both concern and determination. Mike, I do not want you anywhere near that estate. It is too dangerous. Mike bristled at his words, shaking his head. I am not staying behind, Richard. This is about my father. I deserve to be there. Richard opened his mouth to protest, but one look at Mike's face, and he knew it was no use. Mike was not backing down. He had come too far, learned too much, and he was not about to sit on the sidelines now. All right, Richard said finally. But we do this carefully. No risks. If anything feels off, we pull back. Mike nodded, though he knew deep down that pulling back was not an option. Not for him, not when they were so close to getting the justice his father deserved. The drive to Lisa's family estate the next evening was tense, the silence between Mike and Richard thick with anticipation. The estate was far from the city, nestled in the quiet, sprawling hills of upstate New York. The sun had already dipped below the horizon by the time they pulled up to the long winding driveway, the shadow of the massive estate looming in the distance. The estate was exactly how Ryan had described it, abandoned, but still intimidating. The old mansion sat at the end of the driveway, its tall iron gates slightly ajar as if no one had cared to properly lock them. Overgrown vines snaked their way up the stone walls, and the windows were dark, giving the place an eerie, forgotten feel. Richard parked the car a safe distance from the gates, killing the engine as they sat in the dark, watching for any signs of movement. But the estate was quiet. No guards, no cameras that they could see. Are you ready? Richard asked, his voice low. Mike nodded, though his heart was pounding. Let us do this. They slipped out of the car, keeping low as they made their way toward the gates. The air was crisp, the night still, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig set Mike on edge. His breath was shallow, his nerves tingling with adrenaline, but he kept moving forward. He had to. The gates creaked slightly as they pushed them open, but the sound was swallowed by the vastness of the estate. The mansion loomed ahead, its dark windows like empty eyes watching them approach. Mike could not shake the feeling that they were being watched, even though the place seemed deserted. Once inside the gates, they moved quickly, sticking close to the shadows as they approached the back of the mansion. Ryan had given them detailed instructions on where to find the safe. It was hidden in a small study on the second floor, behind a panel in the wall. Getting to it would not be easy, but it was their only shot. They entered the mansion through a side door that had been left unlocked, the old hinges groaning in protest as they slipped inside. The interior was just as eerie as the outside, dark, cold, and silent. Dust coated the furniture, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. It was clear no one had been here in a long time. Mike's heart raced as they made their way through the hallways, the floor creaking under their feet. Every shadow seemed to move, every gust of wind through the cracked windows felt like a whisper of warning. But they pressed on, moving deeper into the mansion toward the study. When they finally reached the study, Richard quickly set to work, searching for the hidden panel Ryan had described. Mike stood by the door, his nerves on high alert as he listened for any signs of movement. His pulse thundered in his ears, each second feeling like an eternity. There, Richard whispered, his fingers finding the hidden latch. The panel slid open with a soft click, revealing a small steel safe embedded in the wall. Mike's heart leapt. This was it, the files that could bring Lisa down. But just as Richard started working on the safe, the faint sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Mike froze, his blood turning to ice. Someone was here. Richard, he whispered urgently, his eyes wide with fear. Someone is coming. Richard cursed under his breath, his hands working faster to crack the safe. Mike's heart pounded in his chest as the footsteps grew louder, closer. They were running out of time. Finally, with a soft click, the safe door swung open. Richard grabbed the files inside, stuffing them into his bag just as the footsteps stopped outside the study door. We need to go, Mike hissed, his voice barely audible. But before they could move, the door creaked open, and Mike's worst fear was realized. Lisa stood in the doorway, her eyes cold and calculating, a cruel smile curling on her lips. Well, well, she said, her voice dripping with venom. Looks like the janitor finally learned how to play. Mike's breath caught in his throat as Lisa's cold eyes bored into him. The smug, cruel smile on her face sent chills down his spine. The room felt like it had shrunk, every shadow looming, every exit blocked. Mike had been preparing himself for this moment, but nothing could have readied him for the reality of facing Lisa like this. Alone in the darkened mansion, no one around to help. Richard stood frozen by the safe, the files clutched in his hands. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. It was clear Lisa had expected this, maybe even planned it. She always seemed to be a step ahead. Well, I have to say, I am impressed, Lisa continued, her voice slick and smooth as she stepped further into the room. I knew you were getting bold, Mike, but I did not think you had it in you to break into my family's estate. Mike's pulse raced, every instinct screamed at him to run, but there was no way out. Lisa blocked the door, and behind her, a shadow moved, Ryan, lurking just out of sight. He had betrayed them. Of course, he had. The moment they had left the bar, he must have gone straight to Lisa. Richard took a step forward, his face a mask of barely controlled anger. This ends here, Lisa. We have the evidence. Your lies, your crimes, they are all coming out. Lisa let out a low, mocking laugh. Oh, Richard, she purred, shaking her head slightly. You always did have such a naive view of the world. Do you really think a few old papers are enough to stop me? I have been playing this game for years. You think I am going to let a couple of nobodies like you take me down? Mike's hands balled into fists at his sides. You killed my father, he said, his voice steady but laced with fury. And now you are going to pay for it. Lisa's smile faltered for a brief moment, a flash of something dark and dangerous crossing her face. Your father was a fool, she spat, her tone suddenly sharp. He thought he could outsmart my family. He thought he could expose us, take us down. But we handled him, just like I am going to handle you. Before either Mike or Richard could react, Lisa snapped her fingers, and Ryan stepped into the room, his expression cold, his eyes filled with regret. In his hand was a gun. Mike's heart dropped. Mike's heart dropped. I did not want it to come to this, Ryan muttered, his voice low, almost as if he were apologizing. But Lisa, she does not leave loose ends. Richard tensed beside Mike, his eyes darting between Ryan and Lisa. He was not stupid. He knew this was about survival now. You do not have to do this, Ryan, Richard said, his voice calm, steady. You can walk away from this. We can protect you. Ryan's gaze flicked toward Lisa, uncertainty crossing his features. For a split second, Mike saw the hesitation in his eyes. Ryan was not a killer, not really. He was just as trapped as they were. But Lisa stepped closer to him, her voice dripping with venom. Ryan, if you do not take care of this, I will. And believe me, it will be a lot messier if I do. Ryan's grip on the gun tightened, his jaw clenching. Mike's breath was shallow, his mind racing, trying to think of something, anything, that could get them out of this alive. He knew Ryan was not truly loyal to Lisa. He was just scared. And scared people made mistakes. Ryan, Mike said softly, taking a small step forward, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of peace. You do not have to do this. She is using you. If you go through with this, you will never be free of her. Lisa's eyes narrowed dangerously, but Mike pressed on, his voice firm and steady. If you pull that trigger, your life will always belong to her. But if you help us, you can walk away. You can start over. For a long moment, the room was silent. The only sound was the pounding of Mike's heart in his ears. Ryan's gaze flicked between Mike and Lisa, torn between his fear of Lisa and the possibility of escape. Lisa, sensing his hesitation, stepped closer to him, her voice low and dangerous. Ryan, do not be stupid. You know what I will do to you if you do not handle this. Ryan's hand wavered, the gun shaking slightly. Mike held his breath, praying that he would make the right choice. He could see the war playing out in Ryan's mind, the fear, the uncertainty. But then, something shifted in his expression. His eyes softened, his grip on the gun loosening just slightly. I am sorry, Ryan whispered, lowering the gun. Lisa's eyes flared with fury. You coward! She hissed, lunging toward him. But Richard was faster. He stepped between Lisa and Ryan, grabbing Lisa's arm and twisting it behind her back with a swift, controlled motion. She let out a furious scream, but Richard held her firmly, his grip unyielding. Ryan, get the gun! Richard barked, and Ryan quickly bent down, retrieving the weapon from the floor where he had dropped it. Mike's pulse was racing, adrenaline flooding his veins. They had Lisa, they had the files, they had everything they needed to end this nightmare once and for all. But as they began to secure Lisa, something else clicked into place in Mike's mind. This was not just about taking Lisa down. This was about justice, for his father, for the years he had lost, for the life that had been stolen from him. Lisa struggled in Richard's grip, her face twisted in fury. You think this is over? She spat, her voice filled with venom. You think you have won? Richard's eyes were cold as he tightened his hold on her. It is over, Lisa. But Lisa's smile returned, slow and dangerous. You are a fool, Richard. You have always been a fool. You really think I do not have a plan for this? Mike's heart sank as Lisa's words hit him like a slap to the face. Of course Lisa had a plan. She always did. She was not the type to go down without a fight. Suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the mansion, and Mike's stomach turned. More of Lisa's people. They were out of time. We need to get out of here now, Ryan said urgently, his voice shaking. Richard nodded, pulling Lisa toward the door, but Mike could feel the panic rising in his chest. They had the evidence, but they still had to get out alive. Lisa's men were closing in, and they were trapped inside the mansion. As they hurried down the hallway, Lisa's laughter echoed behind them, chilling and full of malice. You are all dead, she sneered. You do not even realize it yet. But Mike was not ready to give up, not now, not when they were so close. He had fought too hard to let Lisa win. They had to make it out. They had to. As they reached the front door, the sounds of footsteps grew louder. Richard glanced at Mike, his eyes filled with determination. Stay close, he said. We are going to make it. Mike nodded, his pulse pounding in his ears. He could not afford to be afraid now, not when everything was on the line. With one final glance back at the dark, looming mansion, they burst through the front door, the cool night air hitting them like a shock to the system. But they were not safe yet. A group of men, Lisa's hired thugs, appeared at the far end of the driveway. Guns in hand, their eyes locked on Mike, Richard, and Ryan. We have to run! Mike gasped, his legs already burning with the effort. Richard nodded, his grip tightening on Lisa as they sprinted toward the car. The men shouted after them, but they did not stop. They could not stop. Just as they reached the car, gunfire rang out, the deafening cracks splitting the air around them. Mike ducked instinctively, his heart racing as he threw himself into the passenger seat. Richard shoved Lisa into the back seat, slamming the door behind her as bullets pinged off the car's metal frame. Go, go, go! Richard shouted as Ryan floored the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, speeding down the long driveway, away from the estate, away from the danger. Mike's breath came in shallow gasps as he glanced back at the mansion disappearing behind them, the men still firing into the darkness. They had escaped, but just barely. Lisa sat in the back seat, her wrists bound with a piece of rope Richard had found in the car. Her eyes were still full of fury, her lips twisted into a sneer, but Mike did not care. They had her now. They had everything. We did it, Mike whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. Richard nodded, his eyes focused on the road ahead. Mike's breath remained unsteady as they sped down the dark highway. The hum of the tires against the asphalt barely cut through the tension inside the car. Lisa sat in the back, her wrists bound, her piercing gaze burning into the back of Mike's head. Her presence was a reminder that, even though they had her now, the danger was far from over. Ryan, who had been silent since they fled the estate, finally spoke up from the driver's seat. What now? His voice was tight with fear and uncertainty. Richard leaned forward, his eyes hard with determination. We take Lisa and these files to Detective Richard. We have everything we need to bring her down now. Lisa's laugh cut through the air like a knife, sharp and mocking. You really think this is over? She sneered, her voice dripping with venom. You are playing a game you do not understand, Richard. My family has been at this for years. You think a few documents are enough to take us down? You are delusional. Richard shot her a cold look in the rearview mirror. You are done, Lisa. This time, you do not get to talk your way out of it. Lisa leaned back against the seat, her smile dark and unsettling. We will see about that. Mike could not shake the knot tightening in his stomach at Lisa's words. Even in defeat, she exuded dangerous confidence. Something about it was unnerving, as if she had one more card to play that none of them saw coming. As they neared the city, the street lights cast long shadows across the highway, and Mike's phone buzzed in his lap. It was Detective Richard. He answered quickly, his voice shaky but urgent. Detective, it is Mike. We have her. We have Lisa and the files. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Richard's voice came through, steady and calm. Good work, Mike. Where are you? We are about 20 minutes outside the city, Mike replied. We are heading to the station now. Richard's tone shifted, a hint of urgency creeping in. Do not go to the station. Take her to a secure location. We will meet you there. Mike frowned, his heart skipping a beat. Why? What is going on? Richard hesitated for a second, then said, Lisa's family has powerful connections. Mike, we have already had a few leaks within the department. We cannot risk bringing her in through the front door. Just trust me. Take her to the warehouse on 8th Avenue. It is safe. I will have officers waiting there. Mike exchanged a quick glance with Richard, who had been listening to the conversation. He gave a slight nod, indicating they should follow the detective's instructions. Okay, Mike said into the phone. We will head to the warehouse. As he hung up, he noticed Lisa's smile widen ever so slightly, as if she knew something they did not. A chill ran down Mike's spine, but they had no choice. They had to trust Richard. Ryan took a sharp turn off the highway, heading toward the city's industrial district. The streets grew quieter, darker, as they approached the warehouse district. It was an area Mike did not know well, mostly abandoned buildings and factories that had long since fallen into disrepair. The warehouse loomed ahead, a massive, shadowy structure at the end of a narrow street. As they pulled up to the entrance, Mike's nerves spiked. Everything about this situation felt wrong. There were no police cars, no officers waiting to meet them, just the cold, empty lot in front of the warehouse. We are here, Ryan muttered, killing the engine. The car sat in silence for a moment, as they all stared at the building. Richard was the first to speak. Stay sharp, he said, his voice low. Something feels off. They got out of the car cautiously, Lisa's eyes following their every move with that unsettling smile still plastered on her face. Mike's heart raced as they approached the warehouse door, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, but it was too late now. They were in too deep. As they stepped inside, the sound of their footsteps echoed in the vast, empty space. The warehouse was dimly lit, with only a few flickering bulbs hanging from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows across the floor. Mike's pulse quickened as he glanced around. It was too quiet. Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang. Mike spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. 3 men stood at the entrance, guns drawn, their faces cold and expressionless. He recognized them immediately. They were Lisa's men, the same ones from the estate. Lisa let out a soft, satisfied laugh. I told you, she said, her voice cutting through the silence. You do not understand the game. Richard's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as he stepped in front of Mike protectively. What is this? He demanded. Lisa shrugged casually, as if this were all part of some grand, inevitable plan. This is the part where you lose, Richard. One of the men stepped forward, his gun aimed squarely at Richard. Hand over the files, he ordered, his voice cold and mechanical. Mike's mind raced. They were trapped. There was no way out. He could feel the panic rising in his chest, but he fought to stay calm. He had come too far to let Lisa win now. Richard, ever composed, tightened his grip on the bag containing the files. "You are not getting these," he said, his voice steady but firm. The man cocked his gun, the sound sending a shiver down Mike's spine. "I will not ask again." For a moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Mike's pulse pounded in his ears as he waited for something, anything, to break the standoff. And then, out of the shadows, a voice cut through the silence. "Lower your weapons." Mike whipped around, his heart leaping into his throat. It was Detective Richard, flanked by several officers, their guns drawn and trained on Lisa's men. Relief flooded through him, but the situation was still precarious. Richard stepped forward, his eyes locked on Lisa. "It is over," he said calmly. "You are done." Lisa's smile faltered, just for a second, but it was enough to give Mike hope. Richard's officers moved swiftly, disarming Lisa's men and securing the files. The weight of the past few days suddenly hit Mike all at once, and he felt his knees weaken. But he held firm, watching as Richard approached Lisa, handcuffs in hand. "You have lost, Lisa," Richard said as he snapped the cuffs around her wrists. "You are going to pay for everything." Lisa's face twisted in fury, but she said nothing as Richard led her away. The men who had worked for her were taken into custody, their expressions grim. Mike stood there, numb, as he watched them all being taken away. It was over. After all the lies, the danger, and the fear, Lisa was finally going to face justice. But instead of feeling triumphant, Mike just felt empty. Richard placed a hand on his shoulder, his touch grounding him in the moment. "You did it," he said softly. "It is over." Mike nodded, though the reality of it all had not quite sunk in yet. He had fought for this moment, for his father, for himself, and now it was here. But it felt hollow, like there was still something missing. As the officers finished up, Richard walked over to Mike, his expression softening. "You did good, Mike," he said. "Your father would be proud." The words hit him harder than he expected, and for the first time in days, he let himself feel the weight of it all. Tears welled up in his eyes, but they were not just tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of closure. His father's legacy had finally been vindicated. Lisa was going to pay for what she had done, and Mike could finally begin to move on. But as he wiped the tears from his eyes and looked out at the darkened city beyond the warehouse, he could not help but wonder what his life would be like now. The fight was over, but a new chapter was about to begin. The following days passed in a blur. News of Lisa's arrest spread quickly through the city's gossip columns, but the headlines only scratched the surface of the tangled web of corruption, fraud, and murder that Mike had uncovered. It was strange to see his own life splashed across the papers, a story that had once been his private nightmare now fodder for the public. But Lisa was in custody, and Ryan had turned state's witness in exchange for leniency. The files Mike and Richard had retrieved from the estate were more than enough to bury Lisa and her family's criminal empire. Detective Richard assured him it was only a matter of time before Lisa was formally charged with murder, conspiracy, and a laundry list of other crimes. Mike felt a sense of relief, but there was still a lingering hollowness inside him, a feeling that something was unfinished. He had spent so long fighting, searching for justice, that he had not stopped to think about what came next. Now that the battle was over, he was left with his thoughts, his memories, and the uncertainty of a future he had not planned for. He sat in his new apartment, gazing out at the city skyline. The sunset bathed the buildings in a warm golden light, but Mike felt a strange disconnect. The luxury that had once seemed like a dream felt more like a reminder of how much his life had changed. He had inherited a fortune, his father's name was cleared, and Lisa was going to pay for her crimes. But what did that mean for Mike? There was a knock at the door, pulling him out of his thoughts. When he opened it, he found Richard standing there, a soft smile on his face. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. Mike stepped aside, letting him in. Richard walked over to the window, his eyes scanning the city below before turning back to him. "How are you holding up?" he asked gently, his voice full of concern. Mike shrugged, sitting down on the couch. "I do not know," he admitted. "I should feel happy, I guess. But I do not know if I do." Richard sat beside him, his presence comforting. "It makes sense," he said. "You have spent so long fighting for justice. Now that it is over, it is hard to know what comes next." Mike nodded. "Yeah, that is exactly it. I have been so focused on the past, on what Lisa did to my father, on uncovering the truth, that I never thought about the future. And now that it is here, I do not know what to do." Richard was silent for a moment. Then he turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "You have been through a lot, Mike. More than most people could ever imagine. It is going to take time to figure out what you want. But you have a clean slate now. You can start over. Do anything you want." Mike sighed, leaning back against the couch. "That is the thing. I do not know what I want. I have spent my whole life just trying to survive. And now I have all these opportunities. But I feel lost." Richard leaned forward, his eyes softening. "You are not lost. You are just free for the first time in a long time." Mike looked at him, feeling the weight of his words. He was right. He was free. Free from the burden of the past. Free from the secrets and lies that had weighed him down for so long. He had the chance to start over, to build a life on his own terms. "I guess I am just scared," Mike admitted. "I am not used to having choices." Richard nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It is okay to be scared. But you have already proven how strong you are, Mike. You took down Lisa. You uncovered the truth about your father. You can handle whatever comes next." Mike smiled faintly. "I could not have done it without you." Richard shrugged, a playful smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Maybe. But you are the one who made the decision to step up, to take control. You saved my life, remember? And you did not back down when things got tough." Mike's smile grew, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he did not have all the answers yet, but he had his life back. He had choices, and he was not alone. As if reading his thoughts, Richard spoke again. "You do not have to figure it all out right now. Take it one day at a time. And if you ever need anything, well, you know where to find me." Mike laughed softly. "I might take you up on that." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, watching as the city lights began to twinkle against the fading light of the sunset. The weight that had been pressing down on Mike's chest slowly began to lift. It was not gone completely, but it was lighter now, more manageable. Eventually, Richard stood to leave, giving him a reassuring smile before heading to the door. "Take care of yourself, Mike. You have earned it." Mike nodded, watching him go. As the door clicked shut behind him, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he was not afraid of it.